The textbook story of human history usually goes something like this. For millions of years, our ancestors struggled in the brutal wilderness. Then, we discovered farming, tamed the wild, and settled down to build civilization. But the archaeological and historical records point to a very different reality. The shift to agriculture was history's biggest fraud. If we look at the baseline of ancient foragers, they actually worked far fewer hours than the farmers who replaced them. A hunter-gatherer might spend 35 to 45 hours a week finding food and materials. That left them plenty of time to socialize, tell stories, and play with their children. They were also significantly healthier. Because they relied on dozens of different plants and animals, their diet was rich and perfectly suited to human biology. And because they roamed in small, mobile bands, they didn't suffer from the deadly epidemics that would later plague dense cities. If foraging offered a comfortable, healthy, and flexible lifestyle, why would an entire species voluntarily surrender it for a life of backbreaking labor? Nobody woke up one day and decided to invent agriculture. About 18,000 years ago, the last ice age gave way to global warming. As rainfall increased, wild cereals like wheat suddenly began to multiply and spread across the Middle East. Because this wild grain was suddenly so abundant, nomadic bands set up temporary camps for a few weeks a year to harvest the surplus. To make that gathering easier, they started making tiny, rational adjustments. They cleared away competing shrubs so the wheat got more sunlight. They brought water to dry patches. They saved the best seeds and buried them deeper to protect them from birds. Step by step, over generations, foragers became farmers. This map shows where and when these agricultural revolutions occurred. Agriculture appeared in isolated pockets across the globe, from maize in Central America to rice in China, long before these regions ever had contact. The short-term payoff for all this labor was a surge in the total calories extracted from a single piece of land. And with people no longer constantly moving, women could have a child every single year. The human population spiked. But that growth meant humanity had inadvertently burned its boats. If a village of 100 people grew to over 1,000, they couldn't simply go back to foraging. There wasn't enough wild game left to sustain them. They had to keep farming, or starve. The extra mouths quickly wiped out the new food surpluses. To feed everyone, farmers had to work even longer hours. And paradoxically, the average child ended up getting less food than their forager ancestors did. The human body was designed to climb apple trees and run after gazelles. It was not built for clearing rocks, digging canals, and carrying heavy buckets of water under a scorching sun. Fossil records show the transition to farming brought a plethora of ailments, like slipped discs, arthritis, and hernias. This diagram compares the wide, nutrient-dense spectrum of a forager's diet against the narrow, starch-heavy profile of early agricultural societies. Farmers were largely surviving on a single staple crop, like wheat or rice, which lacks the essential minerals and vitamins humans need to thrive. If we continue looking at this dietary breakdown, that reliance on a single staple becomes a deadly liability. If the rains failed or a localized blight wiped out the wheat crop, the entire food supply vanished. Farmers died by the millions in famines that foragers could easily walk away from. To make matters worse, these farmers were now living in dense, permanent settlements, often literally sharing a roof with domesticated animals. It was the perfect breeding ground for infectious diseases to cross over from animals to humans, sparking the first great epidemics. The trap had completely closed. The daily pursuit of a slightly easier life had compounded over generations, ultimately forcing ancient humans to work drastically harder for a worse diet in a disease-ridden environment. We usually congratulate ourselves for mastering nature and bending plants and animals to our will. But if you look at the exact same events from the perspective of the plants, the story flips completely. 10,000 years ago, wheat was just a minor wild grass, confined to a tiny sliver of the Middle East. Today, it covers over 2 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface. It achieved this global dominance by manipulating humans into fighting its pests, hauling its water, and clearing its competitors. The word domesticate literally comes from the Latin word domus, which means house. But the wheat didn't move into a house. It forced us to build houses right next to the field so we could protect it around the clock. We did not domesticate wheat. Wheat domesticated us. Cultivating crops undeniably allowed the human population to multiply exponentially. But for the average individual, the quality of daily life plummeted. In evolutionary biology, success is measured by a single, ruthless metric: the total number of DNA copies a species produces. Evolution does not factor in whether the organism carrying that DNA is comfortable, healthy, or happy. Humans aren't the only ones caught in this gap between survival and well-being. There are over 25 billion chickens alive today. By the brutal math of evolution, they are one of the most successful species on the planet. But as individuals, they live short, confined lives, mutilated and processed on mechanized assembly lines. When we look closely at the agricultural revolution, a cold reality emerges. A dramatic increase in the collective power and population of a species is frequently paid for with intense individual suffering. But if agriculture locked early humans into an exhausting, fragile, and disease-ridden existence, how did society hold together? How did these overworked, undernourished populations avoid collapsing entirely and instead go on to build the massive cities, kingdoms, and empires of the modern world?